When I was a kid, a long time before I really had any say over what we got to watch on TV, my dad would put on a lot of Star Trek. And anyone who's seen the show is bound to remember, even if you were sort of a reluctant viewer like me, all of the technological devices they had on that show. One of the most spectacular devices from the onset, from the debut decades before I started watching, was the communicator. It was a little box that fit in your hand. You could flip the top of it open, press a button, and you could talk with anyone, no matter where they were. It was pretty amazing at the time. Now, when I show you the communicator today, and you're all laughing already because you know that what I've been describing is basically a flip phone from the year 2002. Now, even in the lifetime of the show, this device went from something totally speculative, totally science fiction and out there, to a real-world object that you could hold in your hand. It saw the development of the cell phone in the first place, to the big brick phones, to the widespread adoption of these flip phones, and now to the smartphones that most of us carry in our pockets today that are far more imaginative than anything the show writers came up with at the time. And you could argue that that communicator was actually an early prototype of the cell phone that we know today. Even though it didn't have the functioning technology, it had the design, it had the users, it had the use cases, and all of those were just as influential on the smartphones that we have today as some of the other earlier prototypes. As a matter of fact, one of the early inventors of the mobile phone explicitly stated that Star Trek was one of his inspirations for creating the device. Now, this is actually a pretty common story in the world of tech design. If you ask any inventor, engineer, scientist, designer, they all probably have a similar story of a device that existed first in science fiction before in reality. Now, I'm not an inventor, I'm not an engineer or a scientist, but when I started my career, I sort of wondered if there was something similar to this in my field. Now, I work in food, and I started out working on farms and in markets, pretty much as far away as you can get from the cutting edge of handheld technology devices. But as I moved into food innovation and startups, I started working with a lot of people who could envision new future food systems and then work to make them into reality. But instead of aiming to create new devices, we were creating new values, new systems, new processes. For example, I worked with a group who envisioned a world without trash, and they started a grocery store that was package-free. I worked for a short-lived edible insect production, and then I moved on to co-found a company that used an entirely new circular system to create new forms of animal feed. Now, I work as a food futurist today. And that is a real job, and I didn't just make it up right now. I do get paid for it. And that doesn't mean that I try and predict the future. Nobody can predict the future, but what I do is I look for these new technologies, yes, but also new ideas, new concepts, new social movements that might influence the way our food system works in the future. Now, there's sort of an idea, at least among the public in technology, that progress is linear. It's clear. It makes steps forward. But food doesn't quite work that way. In technology, you see things like Moore's Law that show that computing power, at least over a certain time frame, gets increasingly more powerful in a regular way. Our phones come out in sequence, each one better than the last. Our cars get more efficient, our airplanes get sleeker, our batteries get more compact, but food does not work this way. There won't be a Strawberry 2.0 release next year. You can't turn in your pasta and upgrade it for one with more features. Food progress instead is measured through how sustainable a system is, how just it is, how nutritious it is, how diverse, or even how delicious it is. So how do you go about thinking about how progress evolves in food systems? Well, one of the many ways you can do that is to turn to speculative fiction. So just like technologists can look at science fiction, you can look at speculative fiction to understand how food systems change. And I want to make the case today that speculative fiction is not only a really good way of understanding how food systems might evolve, but it's actually an integral part of those systems itself. And that means that engineers and technologists and food scientists, while they're very important, they're not the only ones who drive progress forward in food systems. So let me start out by giving you a very simple example of how this works. In the late 60s, there was a pulp sci-fi novel called The Stainless Steel Rat. And this novel introduced, for the first time, as far as I can tell in my research, this was the first time that the idea of powdered alcohol was ever put down on paper. It was a new food. It was entirely made up by the author of this. Now, a few years after that novel came out, 4 or 5 years, in 1974, this patent was filed for flowable powders containing up to 60% ethyl alcohol. In other words, powdered alcohol. Now, this is a pretty cut and dry example. Somebody comes up with an idea, and who knows, maybe some of these patent filers read the book and they said, hey, that's a good idea, let's make it into reality. But it's also a pretty simple idea, and it's not really what I want to get at, because it doesn't quite get at those waves of change that I see happening. So let me move on to a more complex, interesting example. In 1982, the movie Blade Runner came out. And ever since then, various architects, designers, urban planners have all talked about the influence that that film's art direction had on their work. They talk about this futuristic LA with dark, rainy streets, towering Art Deco skyscrapers above an urban street-level morass. But one thing they sort of skip over is a brief scene in the movie where the main character, Deckard, goes to a noodle bar and he sits down and he orders a bowl of ramen. Now, in the backstory and in the book, it's explained that in this hypothetical future, animals are almost extinct, and all food, including meat and maybe the noodles Deckard are eating, are grown in a lab. Now, in the real world today, we see that early signals of this actually happening in reality. We see companies who are starting to grow meat in the lab. And we're wrestling with the ethics, the viability, the processes around this. And this is one of the ways that speculative fiction can be really useful in understanding how the future might work, because it gives us a sort of playground where we can test these new ideas before they actually become reality. We can test the ways they might go right and the ways they might go wrong. Another really interesting way that you can look at this one scene in Blade Runner is sort of the casual internationalism that's present in the scene. So let me walk through it again. Rick Deckard, who's played by all-American, blue-blooded Harrison Ford, goes in this future LA and he sits down at a noodle bar, brushing shoulders with people who don't look like him, speaking in broken English and ordering ramen. Now, in 1982, things like sushi and ramen had just begun to sort of leave cultural enclaves and move into the American public food consciousness. So when people were going to see this movie, that would have been a pretty unfamiliar scene. Now, it's also important to realize that within the context, at least in the US, the 70s and 80s were a period of peak anti-Japanese sentiment in the US. So within that context, the idea of this blue-collar American going into LA and sitting down and ordering a bowl of ramen was in some ways just as speculative as the robots or the lab-grown meat in the film. It was sort of a delicate act of imagining a different future. And it wasn't just about the technology. Now hold with me for a second, because I'm going to tie this back to the future of food. A few years ago, the late Anthony Bourdain proposed an idea for what he called Super Pier. Super Pier was a sort of planned chaos of food vendors and food makers in New York City. Now, if you look at the concept sketches for Super Pier, those architectural drawings, they bear a striking resemblance to scenes from Blade Runner. And that's not unintentional, because Bourdain actually said that his concept for this huge new food complex was taken in part from Blade Runner. It was part Blade Runner's sort of futuristic, casual internationalism, and it was partly inspired by the very real food markets of Singapore that Anthony Bourdain often visited. Now, Bourdain was one of the few chefs who really got the connection between speculative fiction and food. And he really worked and got inspiration from speculative fiction. As a matter of fact, he worked on a couple comic books that showed the future of sushi. But we're not all celebrity chefs here. We can't all make those connections. So I want to talk about one more way that speculative fiction can really cause sort of unintended ripple effects that turn into waves of change in the food system. This is my favorite one because it's chaotic and it's unpredictable. So let me take it back to Star Trek. One of the other devices that you might remember from the show is the Replicator. The Replicator is from the sort of hard ends of science fiction. That is to say, it's so technologically advanced that it's more or less magic. We're not even close to something like the Replicator today. Basically what it does is you can press some buttons and instantly create anything you want, assembled atom by atom in front of you. Now what's the most common use for this in the show? It's to create a cup of tea. It's actually called up a few other times in the show to make some other various foods. And it's, from a screenwriting perspective, it's kind of easy to see why. It's very emotional, it's very relatable, and if any of us had that technology available in front of us today, first thing we might do is try and make something tasty. But it also has unintended effects on our food system and what people are creating. Now, a lot of people, a lot of technologists recently have been working on 3D printers. You might have seen these pop up. They're new devices, and a lot of those designers and technologists have, again, talked about shows like Star Trek influencing what they created. But what they couldn't expect is what people actually do with those devices. People took those and they started retrofitting them and using them in new ways and creating things like Dinara Casco's beautiful but strange 3D architecturally inspired cakes. This is a fully edible cake. She has many like these. This sort of thing was not only unimaginable, but basically unthinkable as recent as 10 or 20 years ago. And anyone who saw the original show, they might say, well, maybe someday a technologist will make something that's kind of like a replicator. But they never would have predicted that this would come out of it. Now, when I talk about food instantly appearing in front of us, we actually might not be as far away as you think. This is a Sushi Teleporter. It's created by Open Meals in Tokyo. It's a real existing object. That fancy-looking 3D robotic arm on the side can create sushi from little gel cubes injected with different flavors in real time. A chef in Tokyo can create sushi, and as she's doing that, it can be replicated across the world in Austin, Texas. And what comes out is not real sushi, but what they call 8-bit sushi. You can see why on the side there. Now, 8-bit sushi has never appeared in any sci-fi movie or show. It's never appeared in any speculative fiction. No one could have said that, well, I predict that in 20 years from now we'll have 8-bit sushi. And that's what's really exciting. When you start putting this sort of speculative fiction out in the world, you never know what waves of change it's going to create. You never know what you're going to get. So this is what I want to say to you today. There's simple ways that speculative fiction can create change. I've showed you how it can change the way we design technology. I've also showed you sort of the fuzzier relationship between speculative fiction and food. But that's not where it ends. I started out by looking for these connections with my food, and I didn't really expect there to be much, but I was quickly proven wrong. Whatever field you're in, whether you're a celebrity chef or a movie director or not, you can look for these sources of inspiration. People take stories and they take those concepts, and innovation happens by building on top of what they're already familiar with. It doesn't come out of thin air. So when you leave today, immerse yourself in more of this speculative fiction. Produce more of it. Share it more widely. Because people attach to these stories in an emotional way. And no matter what you end up doing, no matter what you end up creating or reading or watching, I can't tell you what sort of change is going to come of that speculative fiction. But I can certainly tell you that it will make waves of change. Thank you.